Picture this. Every morning, as the mist rolls off a quiet lake in a sleepy Oregon suburb, a 73-year-old man named George laces up his sneakers, grabs his worn-out cap, and sets off on a walk around the water's edge. For years, this has been his lifeline, his way of staying sharp, strong, and healthy. The crunch of gravel under his feet, the ducks gliding across the lake, the crisp air filling his lungs, it's not just exercise, it's his pride. If I can keep walking, he'd tell anyone who'd listen, I can keep going. It's a motto he's lived by since he retired from his mechanic job a decade ago, a promise to himself that age wouldn't slow him down. But what if those daily walks, the ones he's sworn by to keep him young, are secretly speeding up his aging now that he's past 70? What if the very thing he's trusted to hold him together is quietly breaking him apart, one step at a time? This isn't some hunch George cooked up over coffee. It's a warning straight from doctors, backed by science, and lived out by folks just like him who never saw it coming. Today, we're stepping into George's story, a tale of grit gone wrong, and a wake-up call that hit harder than he ever expected, because it's the first chapter in uncovering 8 jaw-dropping facts about why walking too much after 70 can accelerate aging and what to do instead. Facts that might just turn everything you've ever thought about staying active upside down. So, lace up your shoes and walk with me through George's world, because what's about to unfold could change the way you move or help the ones you love keep moving well into their golden years. George's life in Lake Oswego, Oregon, is the kind you'd see on a postcard. A modest ranch house with a sagging porch, a shed-out back stuffed with fishing gear, and a view of the lake that's kept him rooted there since the 80s. At 73, he's a wiry guy still tinkering with old engines when the mood strikes, still hauling his tackle box down to the water every Saturday to fish with his buddies. His hands are rough from decades of wrench turning, his knees a little stiff from years on concrete floors, but he's not one to sit still. Not yet. And those walks, they're his proof. 3 miles a day keeps the doctor away, he'd boast to his pals at the bait shop, grinning as he stretched his legs by the shore. To George, walking wasn't just good for him, it was gospel. But one chilly November morning, that gospel started to crack. The leaves around the lake were a blaze of red and orange, the air sharp with the promise of winter, and George was halfway through his usual loop when a dull ache bloomed in his left knee. He brushed it off old joints. He figured nothing a hot shower wouldn't fix. But by the time he got home, the ache had turned into a throb, and his legs felt like they'd been poured full of lead. He sank into his armchair, puffing hard, and tried to stand up for a glass of water. That's when it hit him. He couldn't get up without gripping the armrests, his hands trembling as he pushed. His heart sank. This isn't right, he muttered, staring at his shaky fingers. At 73, he'd expected some wear and tear, but this was new. And it scared him. He limped to the kitchen, the throb in his knee pulsing with every step, and poured that water with a frown. As he sipped, a question gnawed at him. Is this what I get for walking? Those 3 miles a day, his shield against the creeping years, had left him sore, tired, and stuck in a chair. He thought about the last few weeks, the stiffness creeping into his hips, the way he'd been dragging his feet after every loop. He'd blamed it on getting old, but now, with his knee screaming and his strength slipping, he wondered if there was more to it. Could the walks he'd leaned on for years be turning against him? He wasn't imagining things. Science has been waving a red flag on this for a while, even if George and most of us missed the memo. Fact number 1. Walking too much after 70 doesn't stop muscle loss, it can make it worse. The Journal of the American Geriatric Society calls it sarcopenia, the slow, sneaky drain of muscle mass that kicks into high gear after 70. Walking's great for keeping your legs moving, but it's not enough to build or even hold onto the muscle your body needs to stay strong. It's all lower body cardio, no resistance, no challenge to the fibers that keep you upright and steady. For George, those daily miles were burning calories, sure, but they weren't stopping the fade of his biceps, his core, his grip. That struggled to stand. It wasn't just his knee, it was his muscles waving a white flag. And then there's fact number 2. Too much walking can strain your joints into an early grave. The American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons drops a bombshell. As you age, cartilage thins, joint fluid dries up, and every step hammers away at what's left. For someone like George, past 70 with knees that clocked decades of wear, pounding the pavement 3 miles a day is like asking a rusty hinge to swing nonstop. It's gonna groan. It's gonna give. That ache in his knee wasn't a fluke, it was a warning shot. Studies say repetitive impact without support speeds up joint breakdown, leaving you stiff, sore, and one bad step away from real trouble. George didn't know the stats as he rubbed his knee, staring out at the lake through his kitchen window, but he felt them. Every creak, every wince, it was his body begging for a break. He thought about his fishing buddy, Bill, who'd swapped walking for a cane after his hip gave out last year. Too many miles, Bill had grumbled, hobbling to the dock. George had nodded then, but now it hit closer to home. He pictured his tackle box gathering dust, his Saturday mornings stuck indoors, his independence slipping away with every ache. For the first time in years, he asked himself a question he'd never dared. Am I walking myself into trouble? It felt like heresy. Walking was his rock, his routine. But the pain in his knee and the tremble in his hands were louder than pride. Maybe staying active wasn't what he'd always thought. Maybe there was a smarter way to keep his fight alive at 73. That afternoon, he called his daughter, Sarah, a 42-year-old fitness trainer who lived an hour away in Portland. "Sarah," he said, his voice rough with worry, "my knee's killing me after my walks, and I can barely stand up without help. Am I doing this all wrong?" Sarah paused, then let out a soft laugh. "Dad, you're not going to believe this, but I see this with my clients all the time. There's a whole science behind it, stuff they don't tell you when you're logging miles. Let me look into it and call you back." George hung up, a spark of relief cutting through the fog. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to stumble into a world of revelations, 8 shocking facts that would turn his walking routine into a relic and pull him back to the life he loved. His story was just getting started, and it was about to take a wild turn. Before we keep going with George's journey, I'd love to hear from you. If his story striking a chord, or if you felt that ache after a walk you thought was helping, drop a 1 in the comments below to let me know you're here. Where are you tuning in from today? And if these kinds of real-life wake-up calls about staying strong after 70 hit home for you, share your thoughts below and consider subscribing. George is about to uncover some game-changing truths, and you won't want to miss what's next. George hung up the phone with Sarah, his daughter's voice still ringing in his ears. There's a whole science behind it. Science? About walking? He snorted at the thought, shaking his head as he eased back into his armchair. For 73 years, walking had been as simple as breathing one foot in front of the other, no questions asked. It was his ticket to staying fit, his shield against the doctor's office. But now, with his knee throbbing like a drumbeat and his strength slipping through his fingers, he couldn't dodge the truth anymore. What if those miles around the lake weren't building him up? What if they were tearing him down, step by painful step? As he stared out at the Oregon mist curling over the water, he decided it was time to face the music. And what he'd hear from Sarah and a doctor's stern warning would crack his world wide open. A couple of days after that shaky morning, George booked an appointment with Dr. Paul Carter, a gruff old orthopedist in Lake Oswego who'd seen more creaky joints than a hardware store. He'd been dodging doctors too stubborn, too busy fishing, but the ache in his knee had turned into a full-blown nag, and the stiffness in his hips wasn't letting up either. He shuffled into the clinic, his cap twisted in his hands, and laid it out plain. "I walk 3 miles a day," he said, almost daring the doc to argue. "Always have. But my knee's killing me, and I can't stand up without help anymore. What's going on?" Dr. Carter leaned forward, his eyes narrowing like he'd heard this story 100 times. "George," he said, "you're not the first guy to walk himself into trouble. After 70, those miles aren't doing what you think. Let me spell it out for you." That's when fact number 3 landed like a punch to the gut. Walking too much wears out your joints faster than you'd ever guess. The American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons doesn't mince words. After 70, your cartilage is already thinning, your joint fluids drying up, and every step's a tiny hammer blow to what's left. Dr. Carter tapped a model knee on his desk. See this? You've been grinding it down, day after day. Walking's low impact, sure, but 3 miles on repeat? That's a recipe for strain, especially with no support. George swallowed hard. His knees weren't just sore, they were screaming for a break, worn raw from years of pounding the gravel path. So I'm wrecking myself? He asked, voice low. Carter nodded. Pretty much. You've got to ease off, or you'll be hobbling for good. He left the clinic with a referral to physical therapy and a warning ringing in his ears. Cut the miles, George. There's more to staying strong than walking. Cut the miles. It sounded nuts. Walking was his thing, his identity. Without it, what was he? Some guy stuck on the porch, watching the lake instead of circling it? That night, he skipped his loop, settling for a slow shuffle to the mailbox instead. It felt wrong, like he was giving up, but when he got back, his knee didn't throb as much. He sank into his chair, staring at his fishing rod propped in the corner. Maybe the doc's got a point, he muttered. But the doubts still gnawed. If walking wasn't the answer, what was? The next day, Sarah called back, her voice crackling with energy. Dad, I've been digging into this, it's wild. Remember that time you almost tripped by the lake last month? That's part of it too. George frowned, leaning against the kitchen counter as he gripped the phone. Tripped? He said. Yeah, that root caught me off guard. Thought I'd dodged a bullet. Sarah's tone turned serious. You did, but it's a sign. Fact number 4, walking doesn't build balance, and that's a big deal after 70. She'd found a study from the New England Journal of Medicine that laid it bare. Walking keeps your legs moving, but it doesn't train the tiny stabilizer muscles in your feet, ankles, and core. Without that, your balance fades in fast. A stumble today's a fall tomorrow, she said. And falls are no joke, Dad. George's stomach twisted. He flashed back to that near miss, his foot snagging the root, his arms flailing, the lake blurring as he caught himself. He'd laughed it off then, but now it felt like a ghost rattling its chains. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention backs Sarah up. More than 1 in 4 adults over 65 falls each year, and it's the top cause of injuries that steal independence. For George, with reflexes slowing and knees that creaked like old floorboards, walking wasn't shoring up his stability, it was leaving him wide open. So I'm a sitting duck? He asked, half joking. Sarah didn't laugh. Not if you change things up. There's better ways to stay steady. Hey, if you're still with me as George digs into this, drop a 2 in the comments below to let me know you're here. Ever had a close call on a walk that made you think twice? Tell me about it. I'd love to hear your stories. Hit that subscribe button if you're hooked on these senior health twists, because George's tale is about to get even deeper. But Sarah wasn't done dropping bombs. And there's more. Fact number 5. Walking too much can speed up muscle loss if it's all you do. George nearly dropped the phone. What? I thought it kept me strong. Sarah sighed. That's the trap, Dad. The Journal of the American Geriatric Society says sarcopenia hits harder when you don't challenge your muscles. Walking's great for your heart, but it's not enough for your arms, your back, your core. You're losing more than you're gaining. She explained how those 3 miles were burning energy, sure, but without resistance. His muscles were shrinking fast. That tremble when he stood? It wasn't just fatigue, it was his body cannibalizing itself, piece by piece. George hung up, his mind reeling. Speed up muscle loss? Leave him wobbly? His walks, his trusty shield, were starting to look like a double-edged sword. He pictured his arms, once thick from wrenching engines, now thinner, softer. He thought about the tackle box he'd struggled to lift last weekend, blaming it on a bad night's sleep. Now he saw it. Those miles weren't building him up, they were wearing him thin, inside and out. He shuffled to the shed, running a hand over his fishing gear. How many Saturdays had he missed because he was too stiff, too tired? How many more would he lose if he kept this up? It wasn't just his knee at stake, it was his life. That night, he skipped the lake again, opting for a slow lap around his yard instead. His knee still ached, but it was quieter, less angry. He stood by the porch, testing his balance, lifting one foot, wobbling, grabbing the rail. Sarah was right. He wasn't steady. He wasn't strong. and walking wasn't fixing it. He called her back the next morning, voice firm. "Okay, kid," he said, "you've got me spooked. What do I do instead?" Sarah chuckled. "You're tougher than you think, Dad. I've got some tricks up my sleeve, stuff that'll keep you fishing, not falling. You ready?" George grinned, glancing at the lake. He was ready to fight back. Little did he know, the real shocks were still coming, and they'd rewrite everything he thought he knew about staying alive at 73. George was starting to feel a flicker of trust in Sarah's words. A week into cutting back down to 1 slow mile every other day, no more 3-mile marathons around the lake, he noticed a shift. The throb in his knee had dulled to a whisper, and his hips didn't groan as loud when he climbed the porch steps. He even hauled his tackle box to the shed without huffing, a small victory that lit a spark in his chest. "Maybe she's onto something," he muttered, wiping sweat off his brow as he tinkered with an old carburetor. He wasn't sold yet. Decades of walking's the cure still tugged at his stubborn streak, but the evidence was stacking up. His joints weren't screaming anymore. He felt steadier. For the first time in months, he dared to hope he could keep his fishing days alive without breaking himself in the process. But fate's got a cruel sense of humor, doesn't it? It was a foggy December morning, the kind where the Oregon mist hangs thick over the lake, turning the world into a gray smear. George woke up with a plan, a short walk to the dock, just half a mile, to check the water for Saturday's fishing trip. He'd promised his buddies a good haul. Trout were biting, and he wasn't about to miss it. He pulled on his cap, laced his sneakers, and stepped out, the gravel crunching underfoot. Everything was fine until it wasn't. Halfway there, his toe caught a slick patch of mud, his balance wobbled, and before he could blink, he was down. His right ankle twisted hard, a jolt of pain shooting up his leg as he hit the ground with a thud. He lay there, fog curling around him, breath ragged, staring at the sky. "Damn it," he rasped, clutching his ankle. Not now. He dragged himself up, hobbling home with a grimace, every step a knife in his foot. By the time he collapsed into his armchair, his ankle was swelling, purple blooming under the skin. Panic clawed at him as he dialed Sarah. "I fell," he said, voice tight. "Twisted my ankle bad, can't even stand on it." Sarah's tone snapped to attention. "Dad, stay put. I'm driving over. We're getting you to the clinic." An hour later, he sat in a sterile exam room, his fishing cap crumpled in his lap, as Dr. Carter delivered the news. A sprained ankle, 2 weeks off his feet, maybe more. "You're lucky it's not broken," the doc said, scribbling a note. "But this isn't random, George. It's your balance or lack of it." George's gut sank. 2 weeks? No fishing? He'd let his buddies down, missed the trout run, all because of a half-mile stroll he thought he could handle. As the nurse wrapped his ankle, Sarah sat beside him, her eyes sharp with worry. "Dad, this is what I was talking about. Walking's not enough, it's leaving you vulnerable. But I've got something better." He looked at her, pain and frustration simmering. "Better? I'm laid up, Sarah? What's better than that?" She pulled out her phone, a grin breaking through. "Fact number 6. Strength training beats walking for keeping you strong and safe." He squinted, skeptical. "Weights? I'm no gym rat." Sarah laughed, scrolling through a study from the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. "You don't have to be. It's not about bench presses, it's about keeping your muscles from fading. Walking burns them up if it's all you do, but a little resistance? That builds them back." She explained how sarcopenia, the muscle loss he'd been fighting, speeds up without challenge. Simple stuff like squats or lifting a light dumbbell could have kept his legs solid, his core tight, maybe even stopped that fall. "You've been running on fumes, Dad," she said. "Strength training's the fuel." George stared at his swollen ankle, the words sinking in. His walks weren't saving him, they were starving him. Sarah kept going, her voice buzzing with urgency. "And here's fact number 7. Flexibility's your secret weapon, and walking skips it entirely." George blinked. "Flexibility? What's that got to do with falling?" She tapped her screen, pulling up a gem from the National Institute on Aging. "Everything. After 70, your joints stiffen, your range shrinks. Walking doesn't stretch you, it just pounds the same old path. But a little bending, a little twisting, that keeps you loose, steady, ready for anything. She mimed a slow stretch, her arms arcing wide. Tai Chi, legs swings. Even reaching for the sky, it's like oil for your hinges. Could have saved your ankle today. George leaned back, the ice pack cold against his skin. Loose. Steady? He'd been a rusty gate, creaking toward collapse, and walking hadn't fixed a damn thing. The weight of it crashed over him. He'd swapped his fishing rod for a cane, all because of a walk he thought was helping. That sprain wasn't just a bad day, it was a siren blaring the truth. He'd missed the trout run, the campfire laughs, the tug of a line in his hands gone, snatched by a muddy patch he couldn't dodge. Tears stung his eyes as he growled, "I just wanted to stay tough, Sarah. To keep up." She grabbed his hand, fierce. "You are tough, Dad. Tougher than most. But tough's not enough, you've got to be smart. Let's fix this, okay?" He nodded, jaw tight. He wasn't out yet, not his fishing, not his fight. But he needed a new game plan. That night, back home with a crutch and a bottle of painkillers, George didn't wallow. He sat on his porch, the lake a dark mirror under the fog, and replayed Sarah's words. Strength training? Flexibility? It sounded like gym talk, not his style. But the evidence was brutal. His balance was shot, his muscles were fading, and walking had left him flat on his back. He hobbled inside, grabbed a broomstick closest thing to a prop he had, and tried a slow squat, leaning on the counter. His good leg wobbled, but he held it, a tiny spark flaring. Then he stood, lifting one arm high, stretching like Sarah showed. His shoulder popped, but it felt good. He sank into bed, the ache dulled by pills and a new grit. No more falls, not if he could help it. The next morning, he called Sarah, voice steady. "All right, kid," he said, "I'm in. Show me how to do this right. I'm not losing another fishing trip to a damn walk." She laughed, bright and sharp. "You're a stubborn old goat, Dad, but I love it. We'll start easy resistance bands, some stretches, a little balance work. You'll be back on that dock before you know it." George smirked, glancing out at the lake. The trout were still out there, waiting. He'd hit bottom with that fall, but it was also his wake-up call, a raw, ragged shove toward a truth he'd never seen coming. His fight wasn't over, it was shifting gears. And the biggest twist? It was about to haul him back to the life he refused to lose. Before we roll into George's comeback, I'd love to hear from you. If his tumbles got you thinking, or if you've had a fall that shook you up, drop a 3 in the comments below to let me know you're with me. What's one thing you've noticed about your own strength or balance lately? Share it below, I'm all ears. And if you're rooting for George to get back to his fishing, hit that subscribe button. His next steps are going to blow your mind. George woke up the morning after his ankle-twisting fall with a fire in his belly. The sprain still ached, the crutch still propped by his bed, but something had shifted. No more letting walks run him into the ground. No more betting his fishing days on a routine that had failed him. Sarah's voice echoed in his head. Resistance bands, stretches, balance work. He'd hit the dirt literally, and it hurt like hell, but it wasn't the end. It was a restart, a chance to rebuild, to outsmart the years instead of outwalking them. As the Oregon sun peeked through the fog, glinting off the lake, he knew he was done limping through life. This was his shot to get back to the dock, rod in hand, and he wasn't letting it slip away. The first week was a test of grit. Sarah drove over with a bag of gear, stretchy resistance bands, a foam mat, a list of moves scribbled on a napkin. "No gym needed, Dad," she said, tossing him a band. "Start small, build up." He ditched the 3-mile treks cold turkey, trading them for a new playbook. 5 minutes of squats with the band around his thighs, a slow stretch reaching for the ceiling, a wobbly stand on one leg by the counter. At first, he felt ridiculous, 73 years old, teetering like a kid learning to ride a bike. "Am I doing this right?" He'd grumble, ankle throbbing as he balanced. But day by day, the wobble shrank. His good leg steadied, his knee quit its whining, and that tremble in his hands? It faded. He caught himself in the shed one morning, lifting his tackle box with a grunt, no shake, no strain. "Well, hell," he muttered, grinning. "It's working." And then came fact number 8, the final bombshell that sealed the deal. Walking less and mixing it up doesn't just save your joints, it stretches your years. The Journal of the American Medical Association lays it out. After 70, a blend of strength, flexibility, and balance beats repetitive walking hands down. It's not about pounding pavement, it's about protecting what's left: cartilage, muscle, stability, and building what's fading. George's old routine was a one-note song, wearing him thin, but this was a full chorus. The Geriatric Nursing Journal chimes in, cutting walks to once or twice a week, paired with low-impact moves, slashes joint stress and boosts longevity. For George, it clicked. He wasn't just patching up, he was rewriting the rules, and his body was singing a new tune. By week 3, the proof was undeniable. His ankle brace came off, the swelling gone, and he was back in the game, not the lake loop, but his yard, then the dock. He'd hobble out with Sarah's bands, doing leg lifts while the ducks watched, then stretch his hips till they popped loose. The ache in his knee? A memory. The stiffness in his back? History. One crisp afternoon, he hauled a chair to the porch and sat for an hour. No crutch, no pain, just him, a coffee, and the lake breeze. Energy he hadn't felt in years coursed through him, steady and strong. His neighbor, Pete, rolled by and hollered, "You're looking like a new man, George." He laughed, tipping his cap. "Feel like one too." New? Maybe not. But tougher? Damn right. The Real win came at the fishing hole. He'd missed 2 Saturdays, 2 trout runs thanks to that fall, and the guilt had gnawed at him. So, one frosty January morning, he packed his tackle box, strapped on his sneakers, and drove to the lake with a plan. No 3-mile warm-up, just a short stroll to the dock, rod in hand, and a cooler for the haul. His buddies were waiting, lines already cast. "Thought you'd hung it up, old man," Bill called, grinning through his beard. George smirked, setting up. "Not a chance. Took a tumble, but I'm back better." Over coffee and bait, he spilled the story: the fall, the sprain, Sarah's fix. "Cut the walks," he said, reeling in a line. Started lifting bands, stretching, balancing on one leg like a fool. "Save my ass." The crew leaned in, hooks forgotten. "No kidding," said Jim, 75, rubbing his own creaky knee. "My hips been killing me, thought walking fix it." George shook his head, tossing a trout in the cooler. "That's the trap. Wears you out if it's all you do. Try this instead," kept me from the cane. He pulled a spare band from his bag, handed it over. 5 minutes a day. You'll feel it." By noon, the cooler was full, the fire crackling, and George was the talk of the dock. Jim tried to squat right there, wincing but laughing. Bill swore he'd cut his miles. Even Pete, who'd eavesdropped from his boat, paddled over for the scoop. "You're a damn miracle, George," he said. "Thought you were down for good." George soaked it in the fish, the laughs, the spark in his step. He'd lost a month to that sprain, but he'd gained a crew of converts, a little revolution rippling through Lake Oswego's old-timers. Back home, he sat on his porch, the lake shimmering under a weak winter sun. He thought back to that foggy fall, the mud, the pain, the fear, and grinned. It wasn't a knockout, it was a wake-up. He'd shed the walking myth, one shaky squat at a time, and found a rhythm that fit him at 73. Staying strong wasn't about miles, it was about moving smart, listening to his body over some outdated playbook. He'd proven it. Less strain, more life. And as he sipped his coffee, watching the ducks glide, he felt a quiet triumph he hadn't known in years. His story wasn't just his anymore, it was a lifeline he could toss to anyone listening. "If I can pull this off," he'd tell his buddies, "you can too. Check with your doc, mix it up. It's not quitting, it's winning." And that's the kicker. After 70, walking less and working smarter isn't a downgrade, it's a power move. 8 shocking facts had flipped George's script, but they'd also hauled him back to the dock stronger, steadier, ready for the next bite. So what about you? What's one move you'd try after hearing his tale? Drop it in the comments below. I'd love to hear how George's fight lands with you. Maybe it's a squat with a band, a stretch to loosen up, or just rethinking those daily miles. Share your take, your wins, your questions. Let's keep this rolling. And if you've loved riding along with George, hit that subscribe button. There's more where this came from, real stories of grit, health, and beating the odds after 70. Thanks for sticking with me. Let's keep fishing for the good stuff, just like George.